rather than addressing the evidence. Richard Hale looked straight at the woman holding the mop and sneered. "Who let the cleaning lady wander into my courtroom?" A ripple of restrained laughter swept across the gallery as every polished shoe turned toward the quiet black woman standing beside a marble column, her gloved hand still resting on the handle of her cleaning cart. The courtroom of the Franklin County Justice Center had been silent only seconds earlier, filled with the soft rustle of legal documents, the faint hum of the air conditioning, and the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock mounted above the judge's bench. Now that silence had shattered beneath one careless sentence, Naomi Brooks didn't flinch. She lowered her eyes for only a moment, carefully folding the yellow microfiber cloth she had been using to wipe fingerprints from the brass railing outside the witness stand. She had heard comments like his before. Sometimes they came dressed as jokes. Sometimes they came wrapped in smiles. Sometimes, like today, they arrived wearing a tailored navy suit worth more than several months of her paycheck. Richard Hale stood before the jury with the confidence of a man who had spent 25 years convincing strangers to believe whatever came out of his mouth. His silver cufflinks caught the morning sunlight pouring through the tall courtroom windows, and every movement seemed practiced, calculated, almost theatrical. Reporters lined the back row with notepads resting on their knees, sensing another dramatic day in one of the city's most closely watched corporate fraud trials. A dozen attorneys watched quietly from the gallery. Court clerks paused over their keyboards. Even the bailiff shifted his weight, as if uncertain whether to intervene. Naomi simply guided her cart a few inches closer to the wall so no one would trip over it. She had arrived at the courthouse before dawn, as she did every weekday, long before lawyers rehearsed opening statements or jurors filled the wooden benches. She knew exactly which hallway lights flickered for 3 seconds before staying on, which courtroom door squeaked every rainy morning, and which marble tiles always carried faint footprints no matter how often they were polished. Most people never noticed those details. Most people never noticed her. To nearly everyone inside the courthouse, she existed somewhere between the furniture and the walls, quietly making the building presentable before disappearing into the background. Richard smiled again, this time looking toward the judge as though expecting approval. "Your Honor, perhaps someone could remove the distraction before we continue." Another faint chuckle drifted through the room, smaller this time, more uncertain. Naomi reached for the handle of her cart without saying a single word. The wheels rolled softly across the glossy floor, leaving behind nothing except a spotless reflection beneath the morning light. Then, just as she reached the courtroom doors, her eyes drifted toward the large digital display projecting Exhibit 14 across the screen behind Richard Hale. She slowed by only half a step. Her calm expression remained unchanged, but something she saw among the endless rows of financial figures made her stop breathing for just a heartbeat. Naomi Brooks had learned long ago that people rarely looked twice at someone wearing a gray maintenance uniform. They noticed polished floors, spotless glass, and empty trash bins, but they almost never noticed the person who quietly made those things happen before sunrise. Every weekday, her alarm sounded at 4 o'clock in the morning inside the modest apartment she had rented for the past 6 years on the east side of Columbus. By 4:45, she was already driving through nearly empty streets, a cup of black coffee resting in the holder beside her, watching the first traces of dawn paint the horizon beyond the courthouse dome. She always parked in the same corner of the employee lot, unlocked the service entrance with the same worn security badge, and began the same careful routine that had become almost second nature. First the hallways, then the elevators, then the courtrooms before judges and attorneys arrived. It was honest work, and she performed every task with quiet precision because she believed dignity was not attached to a job title but to the care a person invested in the work they chose to do. Few people knew that before wearing work gloves, Naomi had spent nearly 12 years wearing tailored business suits inside conference rooms where corporations trusted her to uncover financial deception hidden behind thousands of pages of accounting records. She had once been one of the country's most respected forensic accounting consultants, a professional whose reports had been cited in federal investigations involving millions of dollars. Judges had listened carefully when she testified. Attorneys had prepared for weeks before questioning her. Universities had invited her to lecture about financial ethics. Everything changed after her mother suffered a devastating stroke that required around-the-clock care. Naomi quietly declined new contracts, sold her consulting practice, and devoted nearly every hour to caring for the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise her. Medical bills accumulated far faster than insurance reimbursements, and when her mother peacefully passed away 3 years later, Naomi found herself rebuilding a life from the beginning. Consulting opportunities had disappeared. Former clients had retired or moved on. Rather than chase the career she once had, she accepted the first stable position she could find inside the courthouse where she had testified many years earlier. The supervisors appreciated her reliability, the custodial staff admired her kindness, and although almost no one asked about her past, she never volunteered it. She believed every person deserved to be valued for who they were today rather than who they used to be. That quiet philosophy had carried her through countless mornings without resentment. As her eyes remained fixed on the financial exhibit glowing across the courtroom display, familiar patterns immediately emerged from the endless columns of numbers. Revenue transfers, asset adjustments, timing entries. They were details invisible to nearly everyone else, yet they stood out to her as clearly as a misspelled name on an official document. One sequence of transactions did not merely look unusual. It violated a fundamental principle of forensic reconciliation that no experienced expert would overlook. Naomi tightened her grip around the handle of her cleaning cart. The mistake was subtle enough to persuade an ordinary audience, but significant enough to alter the entire conclusion of the case. She quietly closed her eyes for a single breath, hoping someone else would notice before it was too late. No one did. The courtroom settled back into its carefully rehearsed rhythm as Richard Hale adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket and walked confidently toward the center of the well. He carried himself with the polished certainty of a man who had spent decades believing every room belonged to him the moment he entered it. His voice filled the chamber without effort, smooth and measured, rising and falling with practiced precision as he guided the jury through charts, timelines, and financial summaries projected onto the large display. Every sentence sounded convincing. Every gesture appeared deliberate. He knew exactly when to pause, when to smile, and when to lower his voice so the silence itself became part of his argument. Several jurors leaned forward, taking notes while reporters hurried to capture each important statement. Richard enjoyed moments like these. Courtrooms were not simply places where cases were argued. To him, they were stages where reputation was built, and his reputation had become one of the most recognizable in the state. Newspapers often described him as relentless, brilliant, and impossible to outmaneuver. Corporate executives sought him whenever millions of dollars were at stake because they trusted his ability to dismantle complicated financial disputes before judges and juries alike. Success had surrounded him for so many years that confidence had slowly hardened into something less admirable. He had developed the habit of measuring people before listening to them, deciding their value from their appearance long before hearing a single word. Expensive suits suggested intelligence. Executive titles implied credibility. Uniforms usually meant someone should stay invisible. That quiet assumption shaped nearly every interaction he had inside the courthouse. As Richard continued explaining the transaction history displayed on the screen, he spoke with absolute certainty that Exhibit 14 proved intentional financial misconduct beyond any reasonable doubt. He highlighted one transfer after another with a digital pointer, emphasizing numbers that appeared persuasive when viewed individually. Members of the gallery nodded along, impressed by the complexity of the presentation. Even several junior attorneys sitting behind the plaintiff's table exchanged admiring glances, quietly whispering about how flawlessly the evidence had been organized. Richard noticed their reactions and allowed himself the smallest smile before continuing. Confidence, after all, could become contagious inside a courtroom. Near the rear doors, Naomi remained perfectly still beside her cleaning cart. The polished handle reflected narrow bands of sunlight stretching across the marble floor while the faint scent of lemon polish lingered in the cool air. She listened carefully, not because she wanted to challenge anyone, but because every additional sentence confirmed what she had already recognized. The transactions were being interpreted through the wrong analytical framework. The supporting schedule ignored reconciliation standards that every experienced forensic accountant would verify before drawing a conclusion. It was not merely an arithmetic mistake. It was an interpretive error capable of changing the meaning of the entire financial record. Naomi looked around the room, wondering whether another expert seated among the attorneys might notice the same problem. No one spoke. Court clerks continued typing. Jurors remained focused on Richard's confident delivery. The opposing counsel scribbled notes without objection. Judge Eleanor Whitmore watched attentively from the bench, her expression composed and unreadable. Naomi quietly exhaled, feeling the familiar weight of professional responsibility pressing against years of chosen silence. She had promised herself that the courtroom was no longer her world. She was here to clean the building, finish her shift, and leave unnoticed before the afternoon crowds filled the hallways. Yet as Richard advanced to the final slide and declared that the evidence was beyond dispute, one thought refused to leave her mind. If no one corrected the mistake now, the truth itself might quietly disappear beneath the confidence of the person presenting it. Naomi's fingers tightened around the smooth metal handle of the cleaning cart as an uncomfortable silence settled inside her. She had spent years training herself to let moments pass without becoming involved. It was easier that way. Simpler. Invisible people were rarely questioned, and invisible people rarely became targets. But the figures glowing on the courtroom screen refused to leave her mind. She looked once more at the sequence of transfers displayed across the monitor. The individual numbers were accurate. The dates were accurate. Even the supporting documents appeared authentic. The problem was the interpretation. A reconciliation adjustment had been treated as direct evidence of fraudulent intent when it actually represented a routine balancing correction performed weeks later. Anyone unfamiliar with forensic accounting could easily miss the distinction. Anyone experienced enough to testify as an expert should never have overlooked it. Richard Hale concluded another confident explanation before taking a slow sip of water from the glass beside counsel table. He appeared completely satisfied that every person in the room had accepted his conclusion without hesitation. The jurors watched attentively. Several spectators nodded as though the complicated financial records had suddenly become perfectly clear. Naomi quietly lowered her eyes. She could still walk away. She could finish polishing the hallway outside courtroom 3 before lunch, and no one would remember she had ever been inside. The case would continue without her. Her shift would end at 3:30. Tomorrow morning would begin exactly the same way as every other day. Yet another thought pushed against that comfortable silence. What if someone lost everything because no one had spoken when the truth was still within reach? She remembered something her mother often repeated whenever they watched evening news together. Character is measured by what you protect when no one expects anything from you. Naomi inhaled slowly. Her heartbeat remained calm even as she lifted one hand from the cleaning cart. Her voice, when it finally broke the silence, was gentle enough that several people barely heard the first words. "Your Honor," she said respectfully, never raising her tone above ordinary conversation. Every head in the courtroom turned toward the back. Even the court reporter stopped typing for a brief moment. Naomi continued carefully, choosing each word with the discipline she had practiced throughout her professional career. "I believe Exhibit 14 may have been interpreted incorrectly." The sentence floated through the courtroom with surprising clarity. Richard turned slowly, his expression frozen somewhere between confusion and disbelief. For a second, no one reacted. The only sound came from the quiet hum of the ventilation system moving cool air across the high ceiling. Then Richard let out a short laugh that echoed against the wood-paneled walls. He looked toward the jury before returning his attention to Naomi, amusement spreading across his face as though she had interrupted with an innocent misunderstanding. "I beg your pardon," he said, smiling politely enough to conceal the sharpness beneath his words. Naomi remained exactly where she stood. "The transaction sequence appears to have been analyzed outside accepted reconciliation methodology," she answered calmly. "The adjustment on that schedule changes the meaning of the entire conclusion." Richard stared at her for another second before giving a dismissive shake of his head. A few attorneys exchanged puzzled glances while whispers spread quietly across the gallery. Judge Eleanor Whitmore leaned forward slightly, studying Naomi with unexpected interest, but she said nothing. Richard slowly placed both hands on the counsel table and smiled again, this time with unmistakable condescension. "That is certainly an interesting opinion," he replied, his voice carrying easily across the silent courtroom. Tell me, ma'am, exactly what qualifies the courthouse cleaning staff to challenge expert financial testimony? Richard Hale let the silence linger just long enough for his smile to spread across the courtroom. A few spectators quietly laughed, encouraged by the confidence in his voice rather than the fairness of his words. He straightened his jacket, folded one hand behind his back, and slowly walked a few steps toward Naomi, as though entertaining an interruption too insignificant to deserve real concern. This courtroom depends on evidence, he said, looking first toward the jury before turning back to her. Not unsolicited opinions from someone pushing a cleaning cart. Several heads nodded automatically. It was easier to agree with the successful attorney than to question him. Naomi remained perfectly still. Her shoulders stayed relaxed. Her eyes never left Richard's face. She had spent years testifying under cross-examination, where the loudest voice rarely belonged to the person who understood the facts best. She recognized the tactic immediately. He was not challenging her observation. He was challenging whether anyone should listen to someone like her in the first place. Richard continued before she could answer. Your Honor, with respect, we cannot allow every courthouse employee to interrupt legal proceedings because they glanced at a spreadsheet while polishing the floors. A few restrained chuckles drifted through the gallery again. One young associate lowered his eyes, uncomfortable with the remark but unwilling to object. The bailiff glanced briefly toward Judge Eleanor Whitmore, waiting for instructions that never came. Naomi spoke only after the room became quiet again. I was not trying to interrupt the proceedings, she said calmly. I believe the court should be aware of a possible analytical error before reaching a conclusion. Her measured tone contrasted sharply with Richard's theatrical confidence. Instead of weakening her words, it made the difference between them even more noticeable. Richard gave a slow, exaggerated sigh. Analytical error, he repeated with an amused smile. Do you hear yourself? He turned toward the jurors again. Ladies and gentlemen, expertise is earned through years of education, certification, and professional experience. It cannot be picked up between emptying trash bins and mopping hallways. His eyes returned to Naomi, lingering briefly on her gray uniform and work gloves before he added, there is a reason experts sit in the witness chair and maintenance staff remain outside the proceedings. The words settled heavily across the courtroom. Several people shifted uneasily in their seats. The statement was polished enough to avoid open insult, yet everyone understood exactly what he intended. Naomi looked down for only a second at the pair of worn work gloves covering her hands. They had scrubbed marble floors, cleaned courtroom railings, and carried heavy buckets nearly every morning for years. She felt no embarrassment wearing them. Honest work had never diminished her dignity. Slowly lifting her gaze again, she answered with quiet sincerity. You are correct that expertise is earned. She said nothing more. She did not defend herself. She did not list accomplishments. She did not reveal anything about her past. Her restraint confused several people watching the exchange. Richard interpreted her silence as surrender. Satisfied that the interruption had ended, he turned back toward the display screen and reached for the presentation remote. Before he could press the next button, Judge Eleanor Whitmore quietly removed her reading glasses and placed them on the bench with deliberate care. She had not looked at the financial exhibit for several moments. Instead, her eyes remained fixed on Naomi Brooks with an expression that had slowly changed from curiosity to unmistakable recognition. The courtroom grew silent once again as the judge leaned forward and spoke four calm words that immediately stopped everyone from moving. Ms. Brooks, please remain here. The room became so quiet that the steady ticking of the antique courtroom clock suddenly seemed louder than every conversation that had filled the chamber only moments before. Dust floated lazily through narrow beams of sunlight pouring across the tall windows, settling softly on the polished oak railings and the marble floor Naomi herself had cleaned before sunrise. No one reached for a document. No one whispered. Even the reporters lowered their pens, sensing that something unexpected had shifted beneath the carefully controlled rhythm of the trial. Naomi remained exactly where she stood, one hand resting lightly on the handle of her cleaning cart, her posture calm and unshaken. She did not mistake the judge's words for approval, nor did she expect rescue. Years of experience had taught her never to assume that truth immediately changed people's opinions. Sometimes it needed patience before it could be seen clearly. Judge Eleanor Whitmore studied Naomi with remarkable focus, as though searching through memories buried beneath years of court calendars, rulings, and countless faces that had appeared before her bench. Richard Hale waited with visible impatience, forcing a courteous smile that barely concealed his irritation. He glanced toward the gallery, then back to the judge, expecting the interruption to end so the proceedings could continue. Instead, Judge Whitmore slowly leaned back in her chair without taking her eyes off Naomi. Her expression no longer reflected curiosity alone. It carried the unmistakable look of recognition that arrives when an old memory finally finds its proper place. The judge folded her hands together and spoke in a measured voice that filled every corner of the courtroom. "Ms. Brooks," she said, "have we met before?" Several attorneys exchanged puzzled looks. Naomi answered without hesitation, "Yes, Your Honor. It has been several years." Her voice remained respectful, almost gentle, carrying none of the tension that had settled over everyone else. Judge Whitmore nodded almost imperceptibly, as if another forgotten detail had returned. She looked briefly toward the courtroom clerk. "Would you please access the archived expert witness registry from approximately 9 years ago?" The request caught nearly everyone by surprise. The clerk blinked once before turning immediately toward the computer terminal beside the bench. Fingers moved quickly across the keyboard while the courtroom waited in complete silence. Richard's confident posture shifted almost invisibly. It was only a slight tightening of his jaw and a subtle narrowing of his eyes, but the certainty he had displayed throughout the morning no longer appeared. Effortless, he watched the clerk's monitor with growing curiosity, unsure what the judge expected to find. Naomi said nothing. She simply stood quietly beside the cleaning cart that had become almost invisible again, the scent of fresh lemon polish lingering faintly in the cool air. The soft hum of the ventilation system echoed through the chamber while the clerk continued searching records stored years earlier. Then a small notification appeared on the screen. The clerk looked at it once, then looked again with obvious surprise before turning toward Judge Whitmore. "Your Honor," the clerk said carefully, "I found a match." The judge extended her hand without speaking. A printed record was delivered to the bench. Judge Whitmore read the first page slowly, then turned another page before allowing the faintest smile to cross her face. Richard could no longer hide his confusion. He looked from the document to Naomi and back again, realizing that whatever history connected the judge and the quiet woman in the gray uniform had never been part of the story he thought he understood. Judge Eleanor Whitmore carefully lowered the document onto the bench, but she did not look away from Naomi Brooks. The years had changed her appearance. The tailored business suits had been replaced by a simple gray maintenance uniform. The leather briefcase was gone, exchanged for a well-used cleaning cart. Even so, the quiet confidence in Naomi's posture was unmistakable now that the memory had fully returned. The judge removed her glasses once more and spoke with the calm certainty that only experience could bring. "I remember you," she said. 9 years ago you testified before this court during the Harrison financial case." A wave of confusion moved across the gallery. Several attorneys immediately searched one another's faces, trying to recall the highly publicized federal proceeding. Richard Hale remained motionless. His confident expression began to fade as Judge Whitmore continued. "Your testimony helped uncover accounting manipulations that had gone unnoticed by multiple investigative teams. The court accepted your forensic analysis without reservation." The courtroom clerk quietly handed another page to the judge. She glanced at it before reading aloud. "Certified forensic accounting specialist. Court qualified expert witness in state and federal proceedings. More than 100 financial investigations completed." The words. Naomi took her seat in the witness stand with the same quiet composure she had shown while polishing the courtroom railings only an hour earlier. She adjusted the microphone slightly, thanked the bailiff with a gentle nod, and waited for Judge Eleanor Whitmore's instruction before speaking. There was no trace of satisfaction in her expression. She had not stepped forward to prove anyone wrong. She had stepped forward because the evidence deserved to be understood correctly. The large display still showed Exhibit 14 exactly as Richard Hale had presented it. Judge Whitmore invited Naomi to explain her concern. Naomi looked briefly at the screen before answering in a calm, measured voice that carried naturally through the silent courtroom. "The numbers themselves are accurate," she began. "The conclusion drawn from them is not." Every juror looked up at once. Richard remained standing beside counsel table, listening more carefully now than he had at any point during the morning. Naomi pointed toward a sequence of entries near the center of the display. "These transfers appear suspicious only because they have been separated from their reconciliation schedule. When the complete accounting cycle is reviewed, this adjustment reflects a balancing correction recorded after an internal audit, not evidence of intentional misconduct." She requested permission to display the supporting ledger referenced in the same financial package. The courtroom clerk quickly located the corresponding document, and within moments another page appeared beside Exhibit 14 on the screen. The difference became immediately visible. Dates that had seemed disconnected now aligned perfectly. Entries that previously appeared irregular formed a complete audit trail when viewed in their proper sequence. Naomi explained each step without exaggeration, avoiding technical language whenever possible so the jurors could follow every conclusion for themselves. Instead of asking them to trust her expertise, she allowed the documents to speak through careful logic. The atmosphere inside the courtroom changed almost imperceptibly. Confusion gave way to understanding. Several jurors compared the two exhibits with renewed attention. Court reporters typed faster than before. Even the opposing attorneys quietly nodded as the financial narrative became far clearer than it had under the earlier presentation. Richard finally stepped closer to the display, studying the records he had reviewed countless times before trial. This time he noticed the omitted reconciliation reference that Naomi had identified within seconds. His shoulders lowered slightly as the realization settled in. The mistake had not been fabricated. It had been there all along, hidden in plain sight beneath confidence and assumption. After several long moments, Richard turned toward Naomi. The courtroom expected another argument. None came. His voice, when he finally spoke, sounded noticeably different from the polished certainty that had dominated the morning. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." No one moved. "I judged you before I listened to you. I assumed your uniform told me everything I needed to know about your knowledge and your experience. I was wrong." Naomi looked at him with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the day. She offered no lecture, no criticism, and no victory speech. Instead, she answered with quiet sincerity. "We all miss important details from time to time, Mr. Hale. The important thing is whether we are willing to see them once they are in front of us." Richard lowered his eyes briefly before nodding with genuine respect. The tension that had filled the courtroom since morning quietly dissolved. It became clear to everyone watching that the most significant correction made that day had not appeared inside a financial ledger. It had taken place inside a human heart willing, at last, to replace assumption with understanding. The courthouse gradually returned to its familiar rhythm as the afternoon sun stretched long bands of golden light across the marble floors. Attorneys gathered their files. Jurors quietly departed through the side entrance, and the echo of polished dress shoes slowly faded into distant hallways. Conversations that had once been filled with certainty had become quieter, more thoughtful, as people replayed the events of the day in their minds. Judge Eleanor Whitmore remained on the bench for a few moments after the courtroom emptied, looking across the room that had witnessed not only a correction of financial evidence, but a far more meaningful correction of human judgment. Naomi Brooks thanked the courtroom clerk for retrieving the archived records, collected the neatly folded pair of work gloves she had left beside her cleaning cart, and slipped them back onto her hands with the same care she had shown every morning before beginning her shift. There was no celebration waiting for her outside the courtroom. No reporters surrounded her. No cameras followed her into the hallway. She did not expect recognition because recognition had never been the reason she chose to speak. She simply returned to the quiet responsibilities that had been interrupted earlier that morning. As she guided the cleaning cart through the long corridor, employees who had walked past her countless times suddenly paused. A young law clerk held the heavy door open with a grateful smile. A courthouse deputy tipped his hat respectfully as she passed. Two attorneys stepped aside without saying a word, giving her the right of way. Their gestures were small, almost ordinary, yet they carried a sincerity that had not existed only a few hours before. Richard Hale emerged from the courtroom carrying a single leather briefcase instead of the stack of files he had proudly displayed that morning. His pace slowed when he noticed Naomi polishing the brass handrail outside the courtroom entrance. For several seconds, he simply stood there, watching the careful precision with which she completed a task he had once considered invisible. Finally, he walked closer. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, "I hope someday I earn the grace you showed me today." Naomi looked up with the same calm expression that had never left her face. She smiled gently, not because she had won, but because another person had chosen humility over pride. "Every day gives us another chance to see people more clearly," she replied. "That is enough for me." Richard nodded once, extending his hand. Naomi accepted it without hesitation. There was no applause, no dramatic speech. Only a simple handshake between two people standing in a quiet courthouse hallway where assumptions had finally given way to understanding. Richard walked toward the exit with slower steps than he had entered that morning, carrying with him a lesson no courtroom victory could have taught. Naomi turned back to her work. The soft sound of the microfiber cloth gliding across polished brass blended with the gentle hum of the building as sunlight reflected across the spotless marble floor beneath her feet. In that reflection, expensive shoes and worn work boots appeared exactly the same, reminding anyone willing to notice that dignity has never depended upon status, titles, or appearance. It has always belonged to those who choose honesty, humility, and kindness when the easier path would have been silence. Naomi placed the folded cloth back into her cart, pushed it gently down the now peaceful hallway, and disappeared into the warm afternoon light, leaving behind a courthouse that looked exactly as it had before, yet somehow felt entirely different.